Anyone else want a conversation? Welcome. Yeah. Hi, I'm Ed.
What?
Ed.
Ed.
Yeah.
Bradley.
Nice to meet you, Bradley. Please take a seat. Are we still good to go? So Bradley, I'm here at Brown University, and I have a tablecloth that says, "Can you justify not being vegan?" And so I was wondering, what justifications can you think of, or do you use that justify not being vegan?
Well, okay, so I think it's any argument you put for the morality of any action.
Yeah.
There's basically nothing that you can say that you can't poke some sort of hole in. So I would be interested to hear, what would your positive argument be for why eating meat or drinking milk or eating eggs is wrong?
I think it comes down to an issue of necessity. And so in times of necessity, we can justify an action that could cause harm to someone else. And so let's take an example of a human situation. And so there was a plane crash in the Andes, I think in the 1970s. And the survivors of the plane crash survived and lived to tell the tale because they cannibalized on the dead flesh, or the flesh of the other dead passengers.
Yeah.
And so in that moment, we'd argue that cannibalism became a morally justifiable act. Mm-hmm. And so likewise, if we had to consume an animal product to live, that could become a morally justifiable act. But in a contemporary society, especially in the US, where we have an abundance of alternatives, where we can get all the protein, calcium, iron that we need from plants, it then becomes that there is a lack of necessity. And therefore, a lack of necessity means that it's impossible to morally justify the action because the action contains a victim. And so there's the ethical side of it, the moral consideration to animals. There's also the environmental aspect and the fact that raising and consuming animals is devastating for our environment in so many different ways. And so that's why I've posed this question, because I believe that the logical and moral emphasis lies on the side of vegan, but I think that most of us go through life without ever having to justify not being vegan. And because we've never justified it, we've never thought about it or be held accountable for those decisions.
Okay. So I understand your argument. So one way that I would justify it, I think, is if you look at where should our morality actually come from? And so you're basing your argument on the fact that animals can even be victims. So one possible argument you can say is that the basis for morality itself is that you need morality to create a system in which rational beings can live together, right? So moral laws should be something that make life in our society better for everyone, right? So so this is kind of a lot of this argument is not my own thought. So I read a paper by Peter Carruthers. And the argument there is there's this idea of moral contractualism. So basically it's this hypothetical agreement that moral agents agree to morality in a system where morality should benefit other moral agents. So it's you gain something by living in a society where everyone agrees, because most of us understand that there is this concept of morality.
Yes.
We should treat those people better. But since animals have no ability to act morally, then there's no real incentive for humans to treat animals better.
But if we let's take an example of rats. Only unfortunately because they've been studied the most in terms of many tests. And so one of the things that they've seen in animal testing for rats is that rats will share food. They will actually deny themselves a treat if it means not harming another rat. So, if they could shock a rat and they would get a treat for that, but they recognized the other rat was in pain through the action, and so they refused the treat to not harm the other rat. And so we would define that as being a moral action. And so I think that part of the issue when you look at this is we apply a very human-centric idea to what being moral means, but actually the foundations of being moral do exist within certain species of animals as well. And so I think, and I guess one point I was going to make beforehand was, what is it about humans, what is it about our existence that means that we deserve moral consideration?
Well, the fact is we can actually think about the morality. So if a rat's being compassionate, it's being compassionate because it's psychologically painful. Even if I say it's not morally bad to harm animals, I'll still admit, like, if I were to kick a dog, that would hurt me, you know? Like,
Okay,
I don't like seeing other things in pain.
Yes.
So, it's that same kind of reaction for rats, but the difference for humans is that we can actually think about it. We can actually think about, okay, you know, if I harm another human, right? Not only is that painful for me to watch another human be in pain,
Yes.
but you know, that also has other consequences on that human's life, and I can think about a larger, you know, rational picture of morality beyond just, you know, the immediate compassion of, oh, someone else is in pain, I don't like that, you know, that's painful for me too.
But even at the same time, what we see from animals like the rat example is that they can display complex emotions such as guilt. And now guilt's a complex emotion. And so I think it's unfair for us not to grant some element of benefit of the doubt to these animals. And it's the purpose of this conversation really would be to define whether or not the suffering of an animal is something that we should be morally considerate of. And it's not. I think we can sometimes get bogged down within whether or not non-human animals have the same cognitive or emotional capacities as humans. I find that almost to be irrelevant, as it's the purpose of why I'm vegan is because we can isolate the things that matter to us most, an experience of happiness, an experience of joy, but also a reduction as far as possible of the experience of suffering and pain is kind of what drives us. And so those intrinsic values or emotions or feelings are also the same in non-human animals as well. And should the fact that they can suffer and can experience happiness, does that not mean that we should grant them the right to their own autonomy to experience these things in a way that is devoid of human exploitation?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as saying that we should grant them the right. I think it is better when animals don't suffer. So if there's two ways of doing something and one of them doesn't cause animals to suffer, I mean, that is a better outcome, but I don't think that it's a negative moral thing. I think it would be morally neutral to harm animals versus it would be morally good to avoid harming animals. So it's, you know, I would say eating meat would be a morally neutral act, but then abstaining from eating meat and choosing to be vegan, like, that's admirable. I would say that's a good thing, but it's not a bad thing to not be vegan.
What about, say, like an issue of dogfighting? Because we could say that it's admirable to not bet or partake in dogfighting, but is it morally neutral to be involved and to pay and to be a part of something like dogfighting?
Well, I think part of you can argue that you can be you can be healthy without eating meat.
Right.
That's definitely possible,
Yes.
but that's not what we're biologically programmed to do, right? So we have this innate sense of, you know, we enjoy eating meat, and that's, you know, that's kind of, I wouldn't necessarily argue that it's fundamental to you know, human consciousness, but I would say that is how our brains are built. We're built to enjoy meat. We're not built to enjoy watching dogs kill each other.
What is it about our biological makeup or our brain that means that we are hardwired programmed to consume animals?
I mean, we are omnivores. There's the way that our digestive system is built, the way that our mouths are built. We're built to be able to both consume plants and animals. Whereas, you know, some animals are built to only consume plants, some animals are built to only consume meat.
Right.
So
let's say some people believe that we're herbivores. I find that argument. I'm not interested in the subtleties of where we lie on that spectrum. But let's say we're definitively omnivores. As we've already acknowledged, we can live without consuming animal products. And so the argument we're then making is an appeal to nature fallacy, but it also falls in line with the idea of somewhat of a might makes right, in the ability that because we can physically do something, we're then somehow justified to do that thing. But do we argue that like might makes right, or it's kind of a good way to justify our actions?
I wouldn't say that might makes right. I think it's a different thing to say that we can do something versus we are built biologically to want to do that thing.
But so, okay, let's say we're not built biologically to want to kill animals. None of us go about our day wanting to kill the animal. But so at the same time, the reason that we probably go to McDonald's or consume any animal product that we do is partly cultural, partly how we're raised, and also, I guess, habitual as well. And so because we've done this for our whole lives, I don't know how old you are, I'm 24, but went vegan at 20. So up until that point, I'd always eaten these products. And so I could say, well, my brain is kind of naturally hardwired to do this. But I would make the argument that it was a cultural form of conditioning, so to speak, that it's something I'd always done. You go to India, where like 40% are vegetarian, they're going to tell you that, they'll say their brains are not hardwired to eat meat because culturally, habitually, and socially, they never have. And so do you think that kind of intrinsic desire is more of a cultural situation rather than an intrinsically natural one?
I guess that you can always find examples of cultures that didn't have some practice, but I think as far as meat, you obviously gave a few exceptions, but I think the general rule is
Yes.
Most people in most places do eat meat.
Yes.
And there's outliers like India.
Yes, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I would say still that doesn't prevent the general rule from being humans are built as omnivores.
And so do you think that the general rule should define what we deem to be acceptable moving forward? I mean, I'm saying if we think historically, what was the general rule historically would not necessarily be considered as being justifiable today. And so do you think that the part of the reason we feel this way is because we're still stuck in the paradigm of today? And so we lack somewhat of a self-reflection to say, well, actually, this is something we should assess because, well, we're part of that. It's almost like a bandwagon effect, I guess it would be called like a false consensus bias, the idea that because everyone around us is doing it, that somehow makes it acceptable. But with historical context, that isn't always the case.
Well, I would say, I would say like in any historical situation of injustice, I would also say that it's hard for me to go all the way to saying like it isn't a negative to be a part of a historical injustice if that was the norm for the time. But I think it's definitely more of that situation, and then you're a particularly good person, if you oppose slavery in the 1800s.
Yes.
So I realize it's kind of bad for me to go all the way to saying like, oh, well, people who had slaves weren't bad, they just like weren't particularly good. Like I realize that that's kind of a flaw of my argument.
So it's like a morally neutral position to have slaves in the 1800s. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but that the consistency of the argument you're using would suggest that that's what would be the consistent end to that.
Essentially, yes. Or that it's... So I'm not saying that it goes all the way, but I'm saying to the extent that like some historical practice was the norm at some time, that moves the morality more in the direction of it's morally neutral to be part of that process versus it's morally good. It's particularly morally good to not be part of that process.
And I do understand what you're saying by that because of the cultural aspects, the kind of the paradigm suggesting that's acceptable. And so if we established earlier from your own admittance that to be vegan would be seen as an admirable act, right? And if it's therefore seen to be an admirable act, then why isn't that an act that we should strive to be? Why wouldn't we want to be admirable in that sense?
I mean, well, there's a lot of things that you can do that are admirable, and it's like you only have so much effort you can put into it. So, if you're, you can do all kinds of morally admirable things. You can donate lots of money, and I don't think you can say that like someone who's, a philanthropist who gives like 90% of their money away to charity or something, but who also happens to eat meat. Like, it's hard for me to say like, oh, that's a bad person because they did this one thing that's wrong. So it's good to at least like choose a set of things that it's like, well, I can at least do this, and these things are morally admirable. And so, I would say veganism is one of those, but I don't think you necessarily like that it necessarily negates all of the other good stuff that you're doing if you're not a vegan.
I think that's a valid point in the sense of there are so many aspects of our life we need to consider, but I also think it almost creates some sort of a defeatist attitude where we overwhelm ourselves with the abundance of things that we could change as individuals, but also as a society, and we say, well, then I'm going to push this aside. But intrinsically, what we consume 3 times a day is one of the biggest habits that we have. And so, and also, situations of injustice are not mutually exclusive. And we do have it in our ability to care about human issues, and that could be homelessness, or it could be poverty in the third world, whatever it is. But at the same time, 3 times a day when we're eating, we're just simply eating plants. When it becomes your new habit, it's an unconscious decision in the same way that going to the cafeteria now and buying a chicken sandwich is an unconscious decision. So it's about changing those habits and routines, and that may take up time at the beginning, but once you've done that, it's no different to now, and then you can focus on becoming more morally admirable in other departments. For me, the problem I see is I don't understand why we wouldn't do it. That's if we have that power, we have that control to do it, and what happens to animals is directly influenced by we as consumers. Then that means we can empower ourselves to know that we can change something that we deem to be, even at the best scenario, morally neutral. But I would say to be morally deficit.
Well, the fact is, like, with the current economic market, basically just about anything you do is harming someone, right? Like the clothes we buy, the phones we buy, it's all made by, or I won't say all of it, but the majority of it is made by people in disadvantaged situations, by people who are being taken advantage of by a corporation.
Yes.
So,
But let's hold
meat might be one of those,
Yeah.
but like, still the stuff, the vegetables or whatever it would be that you would be eating instead of meat, well, that was also probably produced by people who are being taken advantage of by a corporation. So it doesn't seem like you're avoiding that much harm by saying, okay, well, I'll just stop eating meat, right? Because then you're still hurting people. You're participating in the modern economic system.
But is that not the duty and responsibility of our society to hold ourselves morally accountable to these things and say, yes, there's no denying that exploitation can happen to human workers in crop farming, but we've got to also look at the fact that in animal-based farming, those animals are fed crops. So you've got the exploitation of humans there for crops anyway. You then have the exploitation of the animals who are being killed, and then you have the exploitation of slaughterhouse workers who suffer psychological problems. And so we can isolate that there's a huge system of exploitation there. Now, that doesn't negate the exploitation that happens to humans in plant-based agriculture, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop eating animals, eliminate those problems, and then try to address the other issues that occur. I think we overwhelm ourselves with all these exploitative situations in our world, and then we become almost apathetic to trying to change anything. But we can isolate, as a progressive society, or as I should say, as a civilized society, all these different aspects, and then hold ourselves accountable to change these things. I mean, we should be buying our clothes from ethical retailers and secondhand stores, but also we should be asking those clothing retailers to change how they produce those clothes. But at the same time, one form of exploitation that we occur in doesn't justify all of them. And I just think let's hold ourselves accountable and use veganism as a stepping stone to living more consciously and helping other areas as well. That's what I think.
Okay, that's a reasonable argument. Yeah. But so you're saying, well, that we should just work towards making the practice better. So why can't that extend to the meat industry as well? Why can't we say, okay, well, factory farms exploit animals, right, so let's try to make a farming system where we encourage more free range animals. We say, okay, well, we'll make animals suffer less in their life, and that way we won't be exploiting them as much. But that doesn't necessarily, we can have a system that doesn't exploit animals, but we would still be able to eat meat and have animal products.
So the situations of human exploitation in crop farming or garment production, to improve the standards for the living conditions and the working conditions of these humans is mutually beneficial. Both parties win in that situation. But in terms of what we do to animals, even if we improve their welfare and their standards, it's still not a mutually beneficial or mutually consensual agreement, because animals will still be being killed. And even if we improve it for them, the end result is still the same.
Well, I don't agree that killing animals is necessarily morally bad.
It's not beneficial to the animals.
I think a lot of what's wrong with killing humans is the fact that we have this, we have dreams and ambitions, we have plans for the future, and so if you kill a human, I would say that what's bad about that is that you're depriving that human of the things that they wanted to do for the rest of their life.
Right.
So if animals don't have that, then I would say it's not as bad. It's not bad to kill them because you're not actually depriving them of, the things that they're going to do for the rest of their life because they don't have plans for the rest of their lives.
I would say not as intrinsically complicated as our plans. But we know from having dogs as pets that they look forward to walks. They're excited at the prospect of what they will do in the future. It's a very simple excitement, right? And their aspirations are, of course, very simple, but they still look forward to things. And I would argue that you could use what you're saying there to place humans and their value of life as higher. So if you had a situation between killing a human and killing a cow, you could use the argument you've just made there to justify killing the human. But that's killing the cow. But that's an extreme situation. But the situation that we live in is we have killing the human, killing the cow, or killing neither. And because none of those are a necessity to save the life of the other, killing neither becomes the morally right action, because regardless of whether that cow has aspirations to travel or have a family or whatever it might well be, they still enjoy simple things like grazing and being happy and being maternal, because they are matriarchal beings. And so those considerations still warrant us not harming them.
Well, okay, so you went to the case of, killing a cow versus killing a human. Well, what about killing 1,000 cows versus killing one human?
This is the moral dilemma I have, right? Because I said to you at the beginning, okay, that if it's a necessity, it can be justified. But say we could make the argument killing one chicken is fine if it's necessity, but then 1 billion chickens, 10 billion, there has to be a line somewhere. I think there are a whole host of estimates. I think a conservative estimate is that we are responsible for about 100 animal deaths a year by being non-vegan. That includes like tins of sardines and such, right?
Yeah.
So say it is 100 animals in a year. Say we live to be 80 years old, hopefully longer, of course. So say it is 8,000 animal deaths. Is that worth one human life, or where's that line for you?
Well, I'm just saying, like, I don't know exactly where the line is, but the thing is, like, you're admitting, like, you don't really know whether 8,000 animal deaths is worth one human life. So, it's hard to quantify, and really the only thing that humans are gaining by killing animals is that we enjoy our meals more.
Yeah.
So if you say
pleasure doesn't justify taking life, we wouldn't have a dog walk past now, and if one of these people here killed the dog, we wouldn't say that's fine because they enjoy it, but will eat the flesh and enjoy that. If we use sensory pleasure as a justification, then we justify things like rape because the rapist enjoys the act of rape. We justify a whole host of really what we'd consider to be abhorrent actions simply because the perpetuator of the violence enjoys that.
I wouldn't say that, because in a case of rape, it's hurting the victim far more than the pleasure that the perpetrator gains.
But it's not about the amount of pain or the amount of psychological torment. It's about the fact that there is an element of pain. And so we could argue that one action is worse than the other, but that the severity of one action doesn't justify the severity, the not lack of severity, but the different level of severity in the other. If an action is wrong, it's wrong universally, regardless of whether one action's worse than the other.
Well, but I think if you say that the benefit that I get from eating one animal, whatever scale you use for determining, how much animal benefit, how much animal benefit is worth the same amount of benefit for a person, right? It's possible that you could say, well, the amount of benefit that I get from eating an animal is worth more than the loss that you got from killing an animal. And I wouldn't say that, I would not say that that's comparable to something like rape, because it's it's
No, not the two actions, but the logic behind the idea that sensory pleasure justifies the action would therefore mean that any action that we as a human or any animal gets pleasure from is automatically justified simply because we get pleasure from it. It's not about saying this is the same as that in terms of the action itself, but the logic behind the justification has to be applied universally in that case.
Well, I would say it's only justified if the pleasure is greater than the harm to the other person, and if also you act in a compassionate way towards the person that you're causing harm towards. So if we...
That's a paradox in itself. I mean, how do you compassionately cause harm to an animal when harm does not need to be caused to that animal?
I mean, it's... If... I mean, it's... Okay, so you can at least say, you can at least say that, like, I'm sorry that something that I got benefit from caused harm to you, without saying that, like, I should have not done that thing. Right? Like, I'm trying to think of an example. This maybe isn't the best example, but let's think about, like, traffic, right? So we let's suppose everyone's time is worth an equal amount of value. So if I am driving and I decide, I need to go, something I do slows you down, if I cut you off or something.
Yeah.
But if the net effect of that action is that I get where I'm going sooner than whatever delay I caused for you slowed you down, I would say that that's okay for me to do, right?
But the and I appreciate that was because probably the comparison came to your head, but it's almost a false equivalence, because what's at stake is so the disparity between what's at stake is life, or like 5 seconds of inconvenience and being slightly more delayed in traffic. And so I understand the logic of what you're saying, but it's a false equivalence in the sense of the two acts are completely, what I would deem to be non-comparable.
Well, isn't your entire life just made up of a series of 5-second periods of time? So if you took off, if you say, okay, well, I'm going to live to be, 89 years and 300 days old. Well, if you then said, okay, I'm going to take off that last day, so it's only going to be 89 years and 299 days, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's one day of my life. I'm not sure that I would care that much, right? So,
but at the same,
your life is just made up of short periods of time, so it is equivalent, and it's just a much smaller scale. So 5 seconds of my life is worth, whatever proportion of the total amount of years I'm gonna live. that 5 seconds is.
But at the same time, if a cow's killed at 18 months and their lifespan is 20 to 25 years, you're taking 18 and a half years off of them. And it's not just small incremental things where they get to enjoy their life. Their life is taken away from them by having the blade pulled across their throat. And so again, I feel that that's kind of pulling at straws, because the two actions again are non-comparable. If over time, because of people wasting your time, you cut a year, which would be a sizable amount of time, off of your life, but you've still had a family and done all the things you want to do, that's still not comparable to pulling a knife across the throat of an animal at 18 months when their lifespan is 20 years.
I would say that it is. I just disagree with you there.
Well, I guess that's probably a natural conclusion, right? Is there anything else?
Yeah. I think that's fundamentally
I think we've
where
done
our
quite well.
disagreement is.
Well, I appreciate the conversation very, very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I really enjoyed that. It was very stimulating, and I've not had a conversation with those kind of topics brought up, so I really, really appreciate that.
I'm sorry, I forgot what you said your name was.
It's Ed.
Ed.
Yeah.
Right.
Was Bradley?
Yes.
I was quite impressed then. Right. Lovely to meet you, Bradley.
Yeah,
Thank you
lovely
so
to meet you,
much,
Ed.
and have a wonderful day.
Yeah, you too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Take care, man.
You too.
Thanks, Bradley.